Hi, I'm Sue from Sue Sherman Quilts, and I'm back today to talk about how to quilt the Giraffe Duo. In the part 1 video, we made the quilt top, and if you'll recall at the end of that, we ironed down all of the pieces in accordance with the manufacturer's directions. After that, I assembled my quilt sandwich using a high loft batting, which I prefer for this project. I've used wool, but you could use polyester. You'll see later in the video why this is important, but it's not crucial if you prefer to use cotton or cotton poly batting. And then I've just used an ordinary piece of cotton in the back. I'm going to be demonstrating the quilting today on my long arm sewing machine. This is a sit down long arm, so it's used in the exact same way that you would use a domestic machine. The reason I use the long arm is because it's got a lot of space here around the needle so that we can get a good look at what's going on. I'm going to be using one color of thread for each of the colors of fabric that I have. I'm using a tri-lobe polyester thread because I like the sheen of it. I have one color for every color of fabric, but in addition to that, I've got white for the glint in their eyes, and I've got this grayish brownish color that's going to be used for the hollow of their ears. In my bobbin, I'm going to be using monopoly. It's an invisible thread. The reason that I use it is because when I change my top thread, I don't want to have to keep changing my bobbin all the time. So when I use the monopoly invisible thread in my bobbin, I just keep using the same thread for the whole project. It's a little bit trickier to use than regular thread, but the secret is that when you wind your bobbin, wind it very slowly and don't wind it full. Go with a half or even less than half full, and you'll find that way the thread isn't pulled out on the bobbin, and that makes all the difference to the way it goes through the machine. I'm going to be using a non-stick needle. The non-stick needle allows the needle to go through the fabric that's combined with adhesive, and it's just like the adhesive wasn't there. It's really quite wonderful. I'm going to start on this spot in the middle of the male giraffe's neck, and I'm going to start with by bringing my bottom thread up and keep it out of the way. I don't need to do a lock stitch here because my stitches are going to cover up this beginning part of the stitching line. What I'm going to do here is what I like to call pseudo thread painting. I'm not going to try to put every hair of the giraffe. It's not really necessary. I think as long as you get enough up and down and try to make it look natural, it gives the illusion of hair on the giraffe, and I'm finding that that's quite effective. It is very, very forgiving. If you've never done any thread painting before, or even if you've never done any free motion quilting before, you might find that this is a good place to start. Once you get the hang of how your machine works, stitching through all this applique, you'll find that things like your stitch length really doesn't matter. Even if your stitch length is inconsistent, doesn't really matter for a natural looking applique or thread painting like this. And bonus, one of the things that I'm going to be asking you to do is to go outside the lines. So as I'm going to be stitching on top of this spot, I'm going to go a little bit below and a little bit above. Not every time, but some of the time. So it's going to be a lot of variation in that. And at the end, when we've done the stitching on the lighter brown that goes in between the dots, you'll see that it actually looks very natural. It looks very much like fur. So let's get started. If you do have trouble with your thread shredding or breaking, one of the things that you will probably find is that it will improve quite a lot if you go more slowly. So you can do a bit of experimenting to find out with your machine just how quickly you can go before you end up with problems. going slower makes for a better project anyway, so it's not that bad. If you find you get bored, then you can tell yourself you're really good at it and you know what you're doing. The only other thing I'm going to mention is when you get to the end, I'm not going to be going back all the way to the end of the spot and back every time. I'm going to be doing shorter lengths. But when I turn around, especially in these ones when I have gone outside the line, I'm going to do a couple of stitches inside the hole before I go back. And that really helps make sure that that bottom thread doesn't come up and show itself onto the right side. You don't want to see the bottom thread, especially if it's not the same as the top thread. So before you turn around, before you go back the other way, do a couple of stitches in the hole, and that'll eliminate that problem. Now I have a certain density of stitching that I like to use that I find looks quite realistic. You can use more dense or less dense than I use. It's completely up to you. But I would recommend that once you get started and you do it a certain way, try to make sure that you do all the spots in the same way. There, that's one spot. And now I'm going to do a little bit of a lock stitch right where I'm at, and then I'm just going to lift up my needle and go over to the next spot, and I'm just going to start sewing. I don't need to do a lock stitch at the beginning, as we said before. I'm not going to cut the thread now. I'm going to cut them all later. That way I end up with a lot less wasted thread. Now I've done this little section of the darker brown dots. I'm trying to do in fairly chunky sections. That's why I haven't gone off and done this little bit. I'll do that after I've done this dot. Now I'm going to switch to the lighter color of brown thread, and I'm going to do the areas in between. But before I do that, I need to clip off all of these connecting threads. Now, I'm not going to clip off my underneath threads because they're all invisible and almost impossible to find. But if you're using the same color in your bobbin thread, and if you care about how the back of your quilt looks, you should also go and clip off the ones in the back as well. I'm using the thread that matches the lighter brown color, and I'm using exactly the same methodology. I'm just going back and forth. I'm imitating the hair. I'm going to go a little over the line, so I'm going to run into the dots on some of them, but not all of them. So now I've done the area in between the spots of this chunk, and now it's basically a question of continuing on doing what I've done here. I'm going to go down to the bottom of this giraffe, and then I'm going to start coming up the neck. Now I've completed the thread painting up the neck, and I've gone all the way up to here. And I'm going to come back and do these areas just next to this orange piece that's the head, or orangey brown. What I need to make sure that when I do these pieces that are right next to the head piece, that I don't go over. In these areas I've been coloring outside the lines, so to speak. But I want to make sure that those lines don't include going up into the head, because that wouldn't look realistic. So I'm going to go back and do these ones. So now, as you can see, I've done a nice chunk here. There's still, I don't want to end up with any areas where I've got an area that's not quilted, that's trapped inside an area that is quilted, because that's going to, you can see how it's not a lot, but there is a little bit of scrunching of my fabric as a result of all this stitching. And we need to make sure that we control that. And it's easy enough to control if you just are very careful about the order in which you do the quilting. Now I'm back to my darker color, and I'm going to start working along the nose ridge. And I'm going to use this chalk pencil to give you an idea of how I'm going to do it. Now the nose ridge is, the way you basically sell it is by making the hairs, by showing how the hairs grow and making it look natural. So I'm assuming that the hairs are going to go straight down the middle of the nose, but they're going to go kind of curved towards the outside like that. And I'm using this chalk, it'll rub off in no time, but it gives me a sense of direction. That gives me an idea of how to do this. So I'm going to start again, over where my stitching already is. I'm not going to start in the middle of this piece because that would leave me with a spot here that's not quilted, that'll get trapped in between the areas that are quilted. So I'm generally following the lines of the chalk that I just had. Now as I get towards the top, I'm going to be using black thread up on the very top of this bump in the middle. So what I'm going to do is kind of feather my, my brown stitching in here, and then I'm going to fill that in with some feathering of the black stitching as I work my way up to the much blacker part of the top of here. But of course I have to work all that in my general decision to make things go very chunky. So here I'm going to start in towards the middle and work out, but I don't want to go, I want to, because I'm getting in an area here that's starting to curve around there and starting to curve around here. I'm going to risk it, but I'm going to hold my fabric very, very flat and make sure it's kind of pulled out so that nothing gets strained. So now I'm going to come in here and do this part of the light colored. Okay, now I'm going to come over here, and what I used to do with these nostrils was I used to ring the inside in black and then ring around the outside of this whitish area with white, and I found it probably would work if we weren't using raw edge applique that does have a tendency to fray a little bit. It works better, I find now. What I'm doing is just going back and forth with the white thread. So basically doing the fur thing with it, and doing it in kind of like a donut. Now in this one you can see I'm using a slightly smaller stitch than I've used for the other, for the larger fur. And I'm also not going over the edges on this, especially not on the inside on the black. If you go over a little bit on the outside, it's maybe not such a big deal. switch back to my darker brown color thread, and I'm going to do the area in between the two nostrils and finish up some of these other areas that we couldn't do before. Now when you look at pictures of giraffes, there's always a few hairs that are sticking out of their chin. And so going beyond here with a few hairs would look very realistic, or at least it would in theory. My experience of trying to do that is it doesn't really look as realistic as I think it's going to. So what I would recommend is just going to the edge, maybe go over it by a touch, but don't use this machine quilting to go beyond there. If you want to add a few hairs at the bottom of the chin, do them by hand after the quilt is finished. Now I'm threaded with a black thread and I need to do the eyes. This is probably the one area that requires the most concentration. What I'm going to do is just go around each eye, and then in this area I'm going to just do one line of stitching that separates the eyeball from the eyelash. So the best way to do that is to actually start with that line. And I'm going to do a small lock stitch. I'm going to go around there, cross on that line. And now I'm going to go around the complete outside of the eye, and I'm going to be stitching with black thread on the black. So this should help keep the piece down, and it should help deal with fraying. And it'll also, I think, look a little better. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the other eye, and because the area where I'm going to go across is so small, I don't want to start there, because if I do my lock stitch in that spot, it might cause some fraying. So I'm going to do my lock stitch down here, go up there. And then just do my across quietly and lock stitch at the end. The main purpose of this stitching is not really to show up. It's not thread painting. Its main purpose is just to make sure that the applique stays down. Now I'm going to come over and do the black bits inside the ears. And these are just like doing the fur, and in particular you want to make sure you go over the edge on these ones. So now I'm going to come and finish the area of the ossicone. And if you remember, the male giraffe uses the ossicones for fighting. That's why the male giraffe's ossicones are smooth and they're much bigger than the females. So the tops of these ossicones are going to be nice and smooth. And similarly, this other bump in the middle of the head, which is made of the same material and it's of a similar purpose. And in the photograph of the male giraffe, you'll notice that it's kind of black at the top and it sort of blends into the face. So what I'm going to do is kind of blend into the brown towards the base of it and then really make it blacker at the top with more stitching. And I'm going to I'm going to go back and forth and around the contour of this to make it look very smooth. So once again, I'm starting at the base so that I'm always moving from an area of stitching to away towards an area with less stitching. So now we've completed this horn in the middle, and it's time to do the ossicones. And I'm going to do them exactly the same way as I did this piece, only it's black on black, so it's a little easier. And I can go straight onto it from here as long as I go with the line of this one till I get to the edge, and now I'm going to change direction and go up here. One of the things that I noticed when I was approaching this pin was that the pin, the way the pin was holding the fabric was not exactly flat with the way the fabric was coming out here. So the stitching is always right. So I took the pin out and readjusted the fabric so that it does all lie flat again. And probably goes without saying, but this horn is in front of the ossicones, so these stitching lines cannot go on top of that. And here I'm creating an area with no stitching that's trapped by two areas that are stitched. I'm going to allow it for this because this area in the middle is sky, but I'm going to be very, very careful about making sure my fabric is good and flat when I'm stitching this area here. Now I'm going to come back and finish those areas of white that I didn't finish before, starting down with this second nostril. Remembering with the nostrils, we're not going up and down, we're going around the outside of the donut. always towards the center and away from the center, and using a slightly smaller stitch here. Now I'm going to move over to the area just above the eyes and the ears. I've put the white thread all the way around the ears and above the eyes in this area, and I've gone heavily the normal way for my fur around the outside edge of the ear, but in towards the center around the black area I've left it a little bit lighter, the stitching, and now I'm going to go over that stitching with a slightly darker color, and this is just to try to transition a bit between the black and the lighter colored thread, and to give a sense of the hollow of the ear. Now the last thing I need to do is just a very small touch, and it's to put the glint in the eye, and I'm going to use white thread for this, and very, very tiny amount, and I want to go in a kind of a curved, it needs to go around the curvature, needs to be only a few stitches, so I'm going to do it right about there, and I'm going to go just like that. And on the other eye, you're really only seeing a sliver of this eye, so you really just want a sliver of this stitching. Now the male giraffe quilting is finished, and we need to do the female. But I can't just jump over there and do the female giraffe, because if I did that, I would end up with an area probably with puckering in between. What I need to do is quilt the area in between the two giraffes first, and then I'm going to quilt the female giraffe after that. When I said earlier that there was a reason for wanting my batting to have loft, this is why. What's going to happen is that I've got the heavy quilting here, and I'll have heavy quilting on this giraffe, but in the sky I want very light quilting. I'm going to have just wavy lines that look like the sky. And so what I want to happen is that the loft in my batting will make those lines, make the area in between those lines puff up, and that will cause the sky area to shrink just a little bit, and it'll match the shrinkage that we've had in the giraffe. So in order for that to work properly, I'm going to start here. I'm going to start at the area of the area that's already quilted, and I'm going to lock stitch into my my sky, which is just a back and forth wavy pattern. Now, if this was a show quilt, I would probably end my line of stitching there, and I would tie and bury the ends. But this is not a show quilt, so what I'm going to do is just go a little bit right stitching in the ditch so you can't really see it along the area of that giraffe, and then I'm going to come back again. Now I'm going to go back up and start again in the middle and go back up that way. Now I'll just do this final bit. You can see that it does make quite a difference. That if I didn't do this step, there would definitely be puckers. So now I'm going to go back and do the female giraffe, and I'll do her exactly the same as I did the male giraffe up until I get to this top part of her head. Now I'm going to do the white and the black stitching around this area. So I want to complete this ear and this bit of white before moving on to this other part. Now the thing about the female giraffe is she does have this bump on her head the same way the male does, but it's all brown and it blends right in. Well, I'm going to turn this around so it's right side up for me. And what I'm going to do is just draw this in. So I'm going to use my my brown thread painting to do something. See, it's much smaller than the bump that the male giraffe had. But generally speaking, other than that, I'm going to be going in the same kind of arrangement that I had before, and down the middle and off to the side like that with the brown. So starting kind of in the center of this brown piece, but because it's connected virtually from the top to the bottom, I can now quilt this entire brown piece. I don't have to do it in bits like I did with the male. Now this little bump is in there, and it's just done with stitching. And I'm going to come up here now and go do the ossicones of the female giraffe, and making sure that I don't go beyond that line of stitching. And when I get to the top of the female giraffe's ossicones, remember her, she doesn't fight with these, and the hair that's growing on the top of them is still there. It hasn't been worn down. So I'm actually going to go up above here to show some hair growing in the top of the ossicones. Now you can see that this line of stitching where we've got the little bump on the top of the female giraffe's head, it's very subtle. You need to get very close in order to see it. But that's pretty much the way it is in real life. And it's a little detail. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, or you don't think it's important, you can just do the whole thing up and down if you like. Now I'm going to come over and finish off these last 3 little dots, and that'll be all of the brown for the lady. So now I'm going to finish the bits of white along here and around the nostrils, and it's exactly the same as what we did for the male. And see how this pin is, there's just a little pucker there. So it's another instance where the way I lined up my fabric at the very beginning, it's close, but it's not exactly right. So now with the black thread, I'm going to continue the exact same way that I did with the male giraffe. Now for the little bit of darker thread for the hollow of the ear. Now for the glint in the eye, and I know it's just a reflection of sunlight, but to me, adding this bit is like breathing life into the animal. I'm going to go back and look at my male giraffe and make sure that when I put the glint in the eye in the female giraffe, I'm going to be on the same side of the eye, because this is where the sun is, and as long as it's meant to be a giraffe that's on Earth, there's only one sun. And there she is, the completed female giraffe. Now it's time to finish the sky. I've reloaded my blue thread into my machine, and I'm going to continue in much the same way that I did in the space in between the two giraffes. It's just going to be wavy lines. Occasionally what I like to do, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 times across the whole quilt, is I'll do a little pinwheel pattern, just if the spirit moves me. I think sometimes that just provides a little bit of interest. I always imagine that this wavy line pattern is kind of like a gentle breeze. In the area where I'm going to be quilting, I'm going to remove all the pins. I want to make sure that the alignment of the top and the bottom layers is the natural way that it's flowing now that everything's been, or that the center's been quilted. And I'm going to start partway up and move down, and then I'm going to continue around, just in an effort to try to sort of start from the middle and move up. The quilting is done, and the quilt is almost finished. The next thing I'm going to do is spritz it with a little water. I don't really need to stretch it and block it the way you might do with some art quilts, but just spritzing it down, getting it a little damp, and then spreading it out like this, it'll make it go nice and flat, and that's really what you want for the finished quilt. The next thing I'll do is trim it. The finished dimensions are meant to be 22 inches by 29 inches, but of course if your quilt would look more balanced at a different dimension, that's okay. There's no, it's just a nominal size. The next thing I'm going to do is add some facing, and I'm going to be using the pieces that I cut off the front, the background blue piece of the quilt when we originally put it together. I'm going to need to piece this piece that goes along the side because it's not quite long enough. So I've cut 3 strips, and the 3rd strip will get cut in half and used to lengthen the strips on the 2 sides, and then the remaining strips will go on the top and bottom. There are a lot of places on the internet, on YouTube, where you can get quite good videos on how to do a facing if you've never done a facing before. I like the look of a facing on a finished art quilt. As you can see, it'll look just like this, so there's no frame around it. But if you prefer to bind it, there's nothing wrong with that either. The last thing is to do a hanging sleeve. And hanging sleeve, there is no fabric with the kit for doing the hanging sleeve. You just need to use any fabric that you have lying around your studio. And there are, again, a lot of videos on YouTube on how to make a hanging sleeve for an art quilt. So the last thing then is to do your label and celebrate that you've finished this art quilt, the Giraffe Duo. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you again when I make another video in the future. In the meantime, happy quilting.